Jung, Art, and Victorian Feminine Emancipation by Tim Faulkner, May 2015. This is a combination of lectures I have given at the Oasis Graduate School, the University of the Third Age, Macedon, and the Bendigo Art Gallery in conjunction with La Trobe University and the Jung Society of Melbourne, Inc. This lecture is directed at explaining art within the framework of Jungian psychology, defining some basic traditional symbolism, and then applying this knowledge in examining the role of Victorian artwork in the feminine emancipation that occurred during the reign of Queen Victoria. The unconscious. Jung was by no means the first psychotherapist to construct a model of the unconscious. The idea of internalized unconscious processes in the mind existed in antiquity and has been explored across a wide variety of cultures. Unconscious aspects of the mind were referred to between 2500 and 600 BC in the Hindu Vedas. By the 19th century, one historian noted it was difficult to find a psychologist or psychiatrist who did not recognize unconscious thought processes as not only real but of the highest importance. Sigmund Freud considered the conscious rational mind as the main mind, and the unconscious mind as a sort of dustbin of forgotten and repressed memories. Jung viewed the conscious mind as a late development and saw the unconscious mind as an important part of the total psyche, having its own language and structure and playing a guiding role in our thought processes. This shows the mind divided into the conscious and unconscious or subconscious mind. The conscious mind uses reasoning, logic, and written and spoken language. The language of the unconscious is patterns, symbols, motifs, emotions, and feelings. Under Jung's model, the unconscious is divided into two layers, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is a reservoir of material that was once conscious but has been forgotten or suppressed, much like Freud's model. The collective unconscious, however, is the deepest level of the psyche, containing the accumulation of inherited psychic structures. Every person shares the collective unconscious with the entire human race. As Jung puts it, the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual. I suppose today we might say the collective unconscious contains some fuzzy hard wiring that enabled the species to survive until it was augmented with the conscious mind. For a healthy mind, we need to bring about a good relationship between the conscious and unconscious minds. Jung referred to this as individuation. And there is a barrier, a filter between the conscious and unconscious minds, and this barrier exists for good reason, as it protects the conscious mind from the raw energies of the unconscious. However, if the unconscious is denied expression, it will make itself felt in other ways, such as through neurosis, anxiety, depression, and so on. Ultimately, it may break down the barrier completely and overwhelm the conscious mind. This is called schizophrenia. In Jung's words, civilized life today demands concentrated, directed, conscious functioning, and this entails the risk of a considerable dissociation from the unconscious. The further we are able to remove ourselves from the unconscious through directed functioning, the more readily a powerful counterposition can build up in the unconscious, and when this breaks out, it may have disagreeable consequences. So how do you bring about communication with the unconscious? You have to use the language of the unconscious. Whereas the conscious mind thinks in logic, the unconscious mind thinks in feelings, symbols and motifs, themes or concepts. What poetry, music, ritual, folk tales and symbolic artwork do is to enable the subconscious to communicate with the conscious mind, to express itself in a safe way. As Jung notes, a true symbol appears only when there is a need to express what thought cannot think or what is only divined or felt. Jung considered art as a connection with the unconscious. He wrote, "What is essential in a work of art is that it should rise far above the realm of personal life and speak from the spirit and heart of the poet as man to the spirit and heart of mankind." He also wrote, "Art is a kind of innate drive that seizes a human being and makes him its instrument. The artist is not a person endowed with free will who seeks his own ends, but one who allows art to realize its purpose through him. As a human being, he may have moods and a will and personal aims, but as an artist, he is man in a higher sense. He is collective man, one who carries and shapes the unconscious psychic forms of mankind." So, on this analysis, much of the content of high art comes from the unconscious of the artist. We can ask, what did the artist intend to convey? But we must also ask, what did the artist convey? Because the artist may well include content of which he had no conscious knowledge. In the most symbolic works of art, the unconscious takes over to a greater or lesser degree. The novelist Henry Rider Haggard described his writing of the novel She in 1887. She is one of the most influential novels in modern literature and has sold over 83 million copies. It was cited by both Freud and Jung. Rider Haggard recounted in his autobiography, "It was never rewritten, and the manuscript carries but few corrections. The fact is that it was written at white heat, almost without rest, and that is the best way to compose. I remember that when I sat down to the task, my ideas as to its development were of the vaguest. All the rest shaped itself round this figure, and it came faster than my poor aching hand could set it down. Well do I recall taking the completed manuscript to the office of my literary agent, and throwing it on the table with the remark, 'There is what I shall be remembered by.'" So these artists are painting not only from the conscious mind, but also from the unconscious, and are throwing up archetypal material of which they may only be dimly aware. Artists paint with their hands, and the hands are closer to the unconscious. Note the dissociation in Rider Haggard's works. Shaped, this figure, it came, and my poor aching hand. Jung wrote, "Often the hands will solve a mystery that the intellect has struggled with in vain." The hands are also used in sand play and art therapy. In hypnotherapy, the hand is used to communicate with a client in deep trance, and it is common where voice and hand signals are used, for the voice and hand to give different answers. The voice from the rational mind, and the hand from the unconscious. Artists need to develop their technical skills, but they also need to develop the ability to draw archetypal material from their unconscious. One way to do this is through meditation, and another way is through exposing themselves to archetypal symbolism. Jungian analysis would also be of benefit for artists. Symbolic analysis involves more than the intellectual interpretation of graphics. It involves the feelings, sensations, and intuitive messages conveyed by the symbols. So as well as analysing the painting in terms of formal symbolism, which is a thinking function, you must ask, how does this painting make me feel? And what immediate sensations am I getting from each symbol? And what does this whole painting mean? Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's research assistant and a great psychoanalyst in her own right, wrote in relation to the interpretation of myths and fairy tales, and the same applies to paintings, interpretation is an art, a craft actually, which finally depends on you, yourself. She wrote that interpretation is like a confession. It is as much about you as the painting, but that is the way it should be. So I will be giving some of my interpretations of some of these paintings, and you might agree, or you might see things I miss, or you might disagree. Also, as von Franz wrote, in the unconscious all archetypes are contaminated with one another. It is as if several photographs were printed one over the other. They cannot be disentangled. This of course applies to the archetypal symbolism of many paintings. We might say the paintings work on a number of levels, or there are a number of facets to them. To illustrate this, consider this painting, The Outcast, painted in 1850. This depicts an angry father ejecting his daughter, who has had an illegitimate child, from his home. We might say it works on a number of levels, or there are a number of facets to it, so the feelings it involves may be one of pity for the daughter, or anger at the patriarchal system where the father has absolute control over the women and children in his house. Under the Roman patriarchal law, the eldest male had the power of life or death over the members of the household, and it may well be the casting out of the daughter and infant into the snow amounts to a death sentence. The daughter in the background is praying, demonstrating the conflict between the concept of Christian forgiveness and the unchristian severity and lack of charity of the father. Only one child is appealing to the father and none to the mother. The mother is perhaps the most intriguing figure of the group. She is losing one of her children and her grandchild, but makes no move to intervene. She has a coarsened, wary face and is not even touching any of her other children. Her marriage to this violent, short-tempered man has crushed her natural instincts of motherhood. She simply does what she has to do to survive, and her children do not turn to her for help. But perhaps she has decided it is better for her to perform the sacrificial act of abandoning one child, so as to preserve the reputation of the others. And this painting can be looked at in a completely different way. It can be viewed as the expulsion of Eve from the Garden of Eden. In the mythology of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve lived in a mindless animal unconscious state until they ate of the tree of knowledge, whereupon they changed to a real conscious state in space and time, with all the awareness and pain that entailed. This daughter could have lived a life of physical comfort, but at the cost of suppressing her feminine instincts in this male-dominated household. But, particularly if she were the eldest daughter, she would be expected to become a spinster, growing old and barren, devoting her life to caring for her parents in their old age. Instead, as Eve defied God, she has defied her father, eaten of the tree of carnal knowledge, and, like Eve, is being cast out. But although she faces danger and hardship, she is taking away with her the spark of life that she otherwise might never have had. This painting will resonate differently with different people. A patriarchal father may become softened by seeing the anger and pitilessness of the father in the painting. A mother may identify with the wife and inwardly resolve to become more assertive. An unmarried daughter, suffering hysteria for want of sexual release, might envy the daughter, and another, a more timid daughter, might strengthen her resolve to remain chaste. A young man who has cast off a girlfriend may feel embarrassment or remorse. There is a saying in hypnotherapy, the mind knows where it needs to go to heal. And sometimes healing for the unconscious can simply be acknowledgement or acceptance. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and whilst that is certainly apt, it must also be accepted that pictures convey archetypal content and that some archetypes cannot be expressed in words, or at least words can only carry a faint echo or parody of their meaning. How would you convey this mother's emotion in a few words? But before we consider the Victorian paintings, let us first consider some of the basic rules of traditional symbolic analysis. With symbolism, put simply, the mind seeks out symbols from its environment to fit into the archetypal patterns. These symbols are called archetypal symbols. The archetype is a pattern, and the archetypal symbol is a symbol that fits that pattern. Many archetypal symbols take the form of persons and may include such persons as the ruler, the hero, the mother, the wise man, the innocent daughter. Thus, for example, the goddess archetype will appear in one civilization as Isis, in another as the Virgin Mary, and in another as Sophia. It is not only the individual that needs exposure to symbolism. Jung writes, "The psychopathology of the masses is rooted in the psychology of the individual." So these images are not just necessary for the psychological health of the individual, they are also necessary for the psychological well-being of the society. Not only that, but they are also needed to help society make changes in the collective unconscious, the underlying values of the society, the Volksgeist. Symbols can create associations with stored images and emotions. Symbols carry messages behind them which speak directly to the unconscious. You see this advertising picture of an old red train. Does that remind you of anything? Here is the picture again, together with a picture from the film Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. It is similar to the Hogwarts Express. Same sort of old engine, red boiler, and all the rest of it, viewed from the same perspective as Harry Potter first sees it. But there is a whole lot that is carried with that, because what does the Hogwarts Express do? The Hogwarts Express is a container, a vehicle that carries Harry Potter from a life of ignominy, suffering and confinement to an exciting wide world of adventure, a world in which he is a valued member with unique qualities, a spiritual world holding out the promise of an afterlife. The Hogwarts Express is a modern-day archetypal symbol, a vehicle for rebirth. Just as written language has rules of syntax, so does symbolism. Serlo writes, "Symbols, in whatever form they may appear, are not usually isolated. They appear in clusters, giving rise to symbolic compositions which may be evolved in time, as in storytelling, in space, works of art, emblems, graphic designs, or in both space and time, dreams, drama, It is necessary to recall that in symbolism, each detail invariably has some particular meaning, and that the way a symbol is oriented also calls for attention. The following are some examples of syntactical rules. Left and right. To go towards the left is to go towards the unconscious and the past. To the right is to face consciousness and the future. These are two panels depicting the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The past, left, is closed, and they are forced to the right, the future. We have already considered this painting, which contains what we might call a Garden of Eden archetype. As you can see, the movement is from left to right. The left, the house, is associated with the past and unconsciousness, and the right, the open door, consciousness and the future. Here is J.M.W. Turner's painting, The Fighting Temeraire. The old fighting Temeraire, hero of the Battle of Trafalgar, but now worn out and obsolete, is towed up the Thames by the modern, dirty steam tug to be broken up. The movement is left to right, toward the future and death for the Temeraire and the former age which it represents, the pending death, symbolised by the setting orange-red sun. In 2005, The Fighting Temeraire was voted the greatest painting in a British art gallery. I want to make an important point here. You do not need to know the story or myth behind an archetypal symbol for it to have effect. The archetypal symbol will resonate with the archetype. This is another funeral, and here the movement is from right to left, but this is no movement forward. The infant will never have a future. It came from the earth, and its parents are returning it back to the earth. The parents have had a setback. They are going back to where they started. Encircling. Serlo writes, "Enclosing beings, objects or figures within a circumference has a double meaning. From within, it implies limitation and definition. From without, it is seen to represent the defence of the physical and psychic contents themselves against the perils of the soul threatening it from without." These graphics are a photograph of a castle surrounded by a moat, and a painting by the pre-Raphaelite painter John Collier of Lilith, sister of Eve, encircled by a serpent. The castle moat keeps the inhabitants safe but confined. The snake around Lilith protects her but also confines her. Up and down, light and dark. In ideological art, the vertical locates the three worlds of the infernal, the terrestrial, and the celestial. This slide shows the harrowing of Hades. The upper sky is associated with light and the divine. The lower regions are associated with darkness and death. Height and light are associated with high morals and intellect. Depth and darkness are associated with the primitive and instinct. It is only logical in symbolic terms that animals and people are made more divine by adding wings to them. For example, horse into Pegasus, man into angel. Carrying this concept on further, the terrestrial, conscious world is the world which is in front of us, which is in focus. Above we have the celestial, and below the infernal. But to the side we also have the unconscious, in the form of the woods, the sea and the desert. Now let us consider from a Jungian and symbolic perspective how Victorian art influenced the feminine emancipation, that occurred during that period of history. The problem women had, leading up to Victorian times, was that the feminine in the collective unconscious was dominated by one feminine archetype, the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary stood for submission, the maternal instinct, and the silent bearing of suffering. To be sure, these are important archetypes, but they crowded out other archetypes of the feminine. This painting by Gainsborough in 1748 shows the squire with his dog, his horses, his sheep, crops, and his wife. Early in the reign of Queen Victoria, women did not have suffrage rights, the right to sue, or the right to own property. At the same time, women participated in the paid workforce in increasing numbers following the Industrial Revolution. Feminist ideas spread among the educated female middle classes, discriminatory laws were repealed, and the women's suffrage movement gained momentum in the last years of the Victorian era. Normally, when we read about the Victorian women's rights movement, it's traced through essays, the formation of organisations, and actions of the suffragettes and Acts of Parliament. But the women's emancipation movement was very much more than women having property rights and voting rights. It was the emergence of the full range of feminine archetypes. As mentioned, earlier art had concentrated on the Virgin Mary as carrying the archetype of the feminine. However, other cultures and mythologies contained a wide variety of feminine archetypes. The Greek goddesses, for example, Hera, woman in relationship, Demeter, the mother, Persephone, the innocent abducted daughter, Artemis, the huntress, Athena, the father's daughter, Aphrodite, beauty and sexuality, Isis, motherhood, magic, fertility, Astarte, Medusa, Circe. Anyone wanting an introduction to the archetypes of the Greek goddesses should read Goddesses in Every Woman by Jean Shonona Bolin. Women's emancipation required a shift in the perception of the legitimate feminine archetypes in the collective unconscious, the Volksgeist. When we think about female emancipation, we tend to think of it as something done by women. But female emancipation needs more than a shift in the collective unconscious of women. Just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, there has to be a shift in the collective unconscious of men. After all, men hold power, and it's a very painful task for them to share it. This shift in the collective unconscious of both men and women was to a large extent brought about by way of symbolism and myth. The symbols and mythology arose because the British came into contact with exotic civilizations, both modern and ancient. These exposed the British to a wide range of feminine archetypes, and also gave British artists and writers a screen or canvas upon which they could project and process unconscious archetypal contents. The art and literature indicates that this change in the collective unconscious of the men was not done without conflict. Men were, at the deepest level, torn between a desire for a fuller relationship with women and a fear that the widening of legitimate feminine archetypes would empower women and destroy the Christian Apollonian civilization that men had created. First, we must set the historical scene. Britain was on a roll. As one writer sums it up, during Victoria's reign, Great Britain would be transformed into the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. Victoria would add to her dignities the title Empress of India. Her children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, including her grandson William II, Emperor of Germany, would fill the thrones of Europe. Her subjects would conquer the frontiers of science, teach the peoples of the world to speak English, and leave few places unexplored. Above all, they would glory in the appellation Victorian. So, with these materials, just sit back, relax, and enjoy yourself. Today our feelings and emotions have been blunted by the sensory overload which we experience from television and the movies. But in the days before colour printing and the cinema, the art exhibitions performed much of the role of the cinemas of today and were heavily patronised. So try and open yourselves up to the feelings and emotions generated by the artwork and literature and poetry, because that is what these artists were doing. They viewed art as a spiritual medium. Experience the colours, the forms, the symbolism. Let the feelings, the emotions of these materials wash over you. Put yourselves in the place of the late Victorians and experience how the artwork and literature affected the 19th century English, who were, on the whole, more romantic, more naive, more open and trusting. Britain rode the crest of the Industrial Revolution, and this not only led to increased wealth, it also led to more efficient transportation and communication, and this facilitated British imperial expansion. The British, for example, controlled India and Egypt. Historians are quick to point out that the imperialist expansion spread Christianity to other civilizations, but the exchange of religion and culture was a two-way street. The Victorians were hungry for all knowledge of foreign religions and cultures. Buddhism, Hinduism, ancient Greek and Roman mythology, and ancient Egyptian mythology flowed back into Britain. Not only existing civilizations, but also ancient civilizations, and often the views of those other civilizations were seen through an archetypal lens, with desired or feared qualities being projected onto the images. The British also, perhaps to buttress their own national identity, looked back with new eyes at the history of their own culture, for example, Arthurian legend and the English Civil War, and this is reflected in the artwork, but it goes beyond the scope of this lecture. Although Queen Victoria was not a feminist, she nevertheless projected a wide range of feminine archetypes. Queen Victoria represented the young innocent Persephone, the counsellor Athena, the ruler Athena, the wife Hera, the mother Demeter, the priestess, the crone, the wise woman. In 1876, Queen Victoria became Empress of India, cloaking herself with the occult spirituality of that ancient civilization. In 1848, a group of English painters, poets and critics founded the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The Pre-Raphaelite painters believed that art was essentially spiritual in character. They emphasised the personal responsibility of individual artists to determine their own ideas and methods of depiction, and they opposed their romantic idealism to the realist movement, a movement of artists led by Courbet who were committed to painting only what they could see. In Jungian terms, I believe we could say the Pre-Raphaelite painters recognised art as coming from the subconscious, the spirit, and wanted to avoid art becoming merely the application of scientific technique, merely the product of the rational mind. And the Pre-Raphaelite painters influenced or were the vanguard of many other Victorian painters, including the neoclassical painters and many of the Royal Academy painters who opened themselves up to painting from the subconscious. And it was only natural that these painters, wanting to imbue their art with a spiritual quality, went back to medieval and Greek and Roman mythology, which is, of course, archetypal material. and this archetypal material contained a rich resource of feminine archetypes. So these romantic painters combined three things. First, they were highly skilled painters who were able to capture the archetypal content of what they were painting. Secondly, they painted a wide range of mythological women who displayed a wide range of the feminine archetypes. And thirdly, they showed these women in a mythical setting, which took them out of the mundane, giving them a timeless, mythical, numinous quality, which enabled the artists and public to process them at the unconscious level. As I mentioned, men were entering into a new relationship with women. They were seeing women as legitimate, sensual beings. This gave men access to a fuller, more satisfying relationship with women, but it gave the women power, and this raised fear in the man. Many of the women painted are nude or wearing little clothing. The reason for this is that women have more sensual and sexual power when they are nude. Under the influence of Christianity and the Virgin Mary archetype, the Aphrodite archetype, symbolising the beauty, sensuality and sexuality of woman, had been repressed. Such a powerful archetype had emerged in Western artwork from time to time through history, but the archetype, which was not suppressed in Greek and Roman mythology, emerged very strongly in a lot of Victorian painting of the feminine. Over and over again, the Victorian paintings projected the desire for the sensual and sexual aspect of women, coupled with a new fear of descent or of domination by the feminine. Victorian academic painting has been dismissed as overly romantic, mawkish sentimentality, artistic pornography, Victorians in togas, but the paintings contain an enormous amount of archetypal symbolism, and if people find them confronting, then that is simply the archetypes at work. It would be nice if we could trace the development of feminine emancipation decade by decade in the paintings. However, different themes were painted at different times by different artists. Also, I suppose, sometimes the painters were painting from their unconscious, and sometimes they were painting in response to customer demand. It is all pretty well mixed up, though perhaps there was a tendency towards resolution towards the end, say 1890 to 1910. Although these paintings often have archetypes superimposed upon each other, I have chosen to identify four classes of archetypal paintings. The first involves the attempted reassertion of male superiority, and this is the St. George archetype. Secondly, there is what I title the La Belle Dame archetype, exhibiting male alarm at the prospect of female emancipation. Thirdly, there are paintings that attempt to suppress women, and this archetype I call the containment archetype. And finally, there are what I call acceptance paintings, where the painter has come to terms with the new face of woman and paints women in a natural manner. Paintings representing the successful repression of desire, St. George and the Dragon. In his major work, Symbols of Transformation, Jung writes about the need for a mediating religion in ancient Rome to curb the brutality and unchained libido that roared through the streets of imperial Rome. He wrote, "The meaning of these cults, Christianity and Mithraism, is clear: moral subjugation of the animal instincts." One theme of the Victorian painters, trying to hold things together, is that of the successful repression or sublimation of desire as represented by knights rescuing maidens from dragons or evil knights. Jung writes, "The annual sacrifice of a maiden to the dragon is perhaps the ideal sacrifice on a mythological level. In order to mollify the wrath of the terrible mother, the most beautiful girl was sacrificed as a symbol of man's concupiscence. The maiden is a symbol of purity. The dragon is, according to Serlo's Dictionary of Symbols, a kind of amalgam of elements taken from various animals that are particularly aggressive and dangerous, such as serpents, crocodiles and lions, as well as prehistoric animals. The dragon, in consequence, stands for things animal par excellence." The predominant symbolism of St. George and the dragon is that it represents the conquest of the base spirits in man, the pursuit of knightly Christian ideals, chivalry, the Knights of the Round Table, overcoming their base instincts and dragging humanity out of the Dark Ages. The Andromeda myth is a St. George theme. Andromeda was chained to a rock to be sacrificed to a sea monster, but was rescued by Perseus. You can see how the sea monster is trying to encircle Perseus. But of course, another side to the St. George myth is that it is designed to show women that men are in control and need to be in charge to stop the helpless maidens being devoured by nasty dragons. Women can be saved from dragons, but they have to give control to the men. This may have been the collective unconscious trying to put women back in their place in the face of demands for female emancipation. So the paintings of St. George, occurring as they did at a time of female emancipation, were attempts by men to emphasise their need to control women. Rather like the Western sheriff, drawling as he is spinning the cylinder of his Colt 45, "Now don't you worry yourself none, little filly, I'll take care of them pesky outlaws." It is the same archetype. Note how in this poster Gary Cooper has his arm around Grace Kelly, but her left hand is not encircling him. Not only does Gary Cooper defeat the outlaws, but he has also cast aside the instinctive, dark, fiery Katie Giraldo, the woman red in tooth and claw, in favour of the blonde, pure Grace Kelly. He has fought two dragons. And in a similar vein, we have a knight resisting the temptation of a beautiful woman, and a holy man resisting the temptation of a beautiful woman. Note the woman has, as her companions, low beasts, what look like chimpanzees and wolves or wild dogs. Again, the theme is the conquest of the base spirits in man, the pursuit of knightly Christian Apollonian ideals. Note also that these scenes are all painted in wilderness areas, the woods, the desert, the seashore, the periphery of civilization and the periphery of the conscious mind. They are painted in the realm of the unconscious. However, we also have the common theme of La Belle Dame sans Merci. La Belle Dame is the opposite of the St. George and the Dragon paintings. It is the overwhelming of the knight by the feminine, the overwhelming of the masculine Apollonian virtues by the bewitchment of the feminine arising out of the unconscious as represented by the woods. La Belle Dame sans Merci, which is French for the beautiful lady without pity, is a ballad written by the English poet John Keats in 1819. Keats' poem describes the encounter between an unnamed knight and a mysterious woman who is said to be a fairy's child. It opens with a description of the knight in a barren landscape, haggard and woebegone. He tells the reader how he met a beautiful lady whose eyes were wild. He set her on his horse, and she took him to her elfin grot, where she wept and sighed full sore. Falling asleep, the knight had a vision of pale kings and princes who cried, "La belle dame sans mercy hath thee in thrall." He awoke to find himself on the same cold hill's side, after which he continues to wait and palely loitering. In Keats's words, "I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long." Now, symbolically, the mounted knight is man representing chivalry, reason, civilization controlling the basic instincts as represented by the horse. So, in surrendering the horse to the woman, the knight has abandoned control to the instincts. And the implied threat, "Stay out of the woods," the unconscious. Other variations on the belle dame theme are Hylas and the nymphs. Hylas, the shield-bearer of Heracles and one of the Argonauts, was kidnapped by nymphs who fell in love with him, and he vanished without a trace. And also the Lamia, a devouring seductress. Some accounts say that the Lamia has a serpent's tail below the waist, a semi-theriomorphic creature. I will discuss semi-theriomorphism in a moment. Although these women have legs, all of them are draped with snake skin. So it seems to me that at least in the Victorian mind, the moral subjugation of the animal instincts, Jung's phrase, required by Christianity was intertwined with the domestication of the feminine. In order to control his animal instincts, man had to suppress the feminine sexual libido as represented by La Belle Dame, the nymphs, and the Lamia. When the feminine sexual libido re-emerges from the woods of the unconscious and seduces the knight descends back into the woods, into the unconscious, abandoning civilization and enlightened reasoning and regressing back to the basic animal instincts. As well as the St. George paintings, where the woman is rescued, there are paintings in which women are controlled or contained, and I will come to those in a little while. But first, the unconscious is not only represented by the woods, but also by the sea, and out of the sea come the mermaids. Their upper half is that of a beautiful young woman, and the lower half that of a fish. Note the way the siren has her tail twined round the fisherman's leg. That is encirclement, and encirclement is a symbol for control. The mermaids, like the Sphinx, are semi-theriomorphic creatures. As Jung points out, it is usual in the case of semi-theriomorphic creatures for the lower half to represent an animal, and he writes, "The libido so represented is the animal instinct that has got repressed." What are some of the legends of mermaids? They are childlike in their thinking. They have no souls. Like La Belle Dame, they have no pity. They are vain and are often pictured with a comb and mirror. They love pretty things, and they wreck ships and play with the treasures, and they unthinkingly lure men to their death by drowning in the sea. The sirens are sometimes portrayed as mermaids or sea nymphs who lure men to their death by their irresistible singing, their siren song. Here, the mermaids are playing with a fish. This was painted in Melbourne. And so was this. Although the title of this lecture refers to Britain, the theme of female emancipation and male reaction was also occurring in the colonies. Note the enigmatic expression on the siren. Serlo, author of Dictionary of Symbols, writes of sirens, "It seems that they are largely symbols of the temptations scattered along the path of life, or of symbolic navigation, impeding the evolution of the spirit by bewitchment, beguiling it into remaining on the magic island, or, in other words, causing its premature death. One author, writing of mermaids, writes, "The mermaid archetype is so widespread among cultures that one may conclude it is very ancient and fulfills a particular need in the human collective consciousness. The mermaid in our culture is the most persistent and pervasive symbol of the old goddess energy that represents women, particularly the mysterious life-generating element. The Christian Church, in promoting the ideas that mermaids were dangerous temptresses and had no souls of their own, was actually stating deeply held beliefs about all women, much as in the case of the witch craze. This beautiful, helpful and compellingly attractive goddess mermaid has been stripped of all her spiritual qualities, hence the stories involving the mermaid's soul could never end happily. They emphasized the supposed faithlessness and inconstancy of women, the danger of their attraction, and the unlikelihood of their gaining humanity." Note the cave, the lyre, and the nymphs casually playing with the pretty coins and pearls like trinkets whilst the ship is broken up on the shore. This is by a woman painter. This painting was praised for its artistic ability, but criticised for its mythical inaccuracy. And then there were paintings of other terrible women who got men into trouble. This painting depicts a scene from Arthurian legend, the infatuation of Merlin with the Lady of the Lake, Nimue. Merlin is shown trapped, helpless in a hawthorn bush, as Nimue reads from a book of spells. Merlin had become infatuated with Nimue and had taught her his magic, which she used against him. In Homer's Odyssey, Circe is described as living in a mansion that stands in the middle of a clearing in a dense wood. Around the house prowled strangely docile lions and wolves, the drugged victims of her magic. Circe turned Odysseus's crew into swine. Men being turned into swine is, of course, a symbol of moral descent. Medea is known in most stories as an enchantress and is often depicted as being the priestess of the goddess Hecate, or a witch. Lilith was Adam's first wife who refused to be subservient to him. Jewish folk tradition associates Lilith both with long hair, a symbol of dangerous feminine seductive power in both Jewish and Islamic cultures, and with possessing women by entering them through mirrors. Aurora was the Roman goddess of the dawn. Victorian Webb writes, "Aurora is inviting and alluring, magnificently beautiful and proud, but she is also divinely powerful. Punished by Aphrodite for enticing Ares, Aurora was condemned to be restless and destructive in her pursuit of young men. The discarded roses that litter the floor at Aurora's feet refer to her inexhaustible passion, and the parasitic bindweed flowers in her hair also allude to her strangling, obsessive desire. She is like the sirens, beautiful, erotic, insatiably voracious, and never able to live happily in the company of men. Aurora was even prepared to hypnotize and rape her lovers as they slept to satisfy her sexual hunger." Draper's femme fatale simultaneously solicit and repel, entice and caution, desire and despise. Morgan Le Fay is a powerful sorceress in the Arthurian legend, half-sister to Arthur, who, in later legends, plotted to destroy him. Note the animal skin worn below the waist and the dragon and snake on the dress, all symbols of animal instinct. The artistic examination of the feminine was not only being carried out by painters, but also by writers, and in particular by Sir Henry Rider Haggard. Rider Haggard is best known these days for King Solomon's Mines. In 1887, Rider Haggard wrote a novel called She. The book has sold 83 million copies and was immensely influential. As Wikipedia describes it, She is one of the most influential novels in modern literature, with authors like Rudyard Kipling, Henry Miller, Graham Greene, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Margaret Atwood all acknowledging the importance of the work to their own and others' writing. Such was the popularity and influence of the novel that it was cited in the psychoanalytical theories of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the latter describing the character of She as a manifestation of the anima figure. Suffice to say, one of the characters is a mysterious queen, a white sorceress named Aisha, whose beauty is so great that it enchants any man who beholds it. One writer noted, "She represents everything men long for, project onto, desire, and are appalled by in women." Wikipedia observes, "The question of female authority is realised to the extreme in the figure of she who must be obeyed, whose autonomous will seemingly embodies Victorian anti-feminist fears of new women desiring absolute personal independence coupled with supreme power over men." Haggard constantly emphasises this anxiety over female authority in She. In fact, Aisha's absolute command over the male sex is one of the most startling and unnerving aspects of the story. Another strong female figure is that of the fairy queen in the Gilbert and Sullivan opera Iolanthe. Although she is portrayed as a jocular figure, there is an underlying message of a powerful woman tearing up the cosy male political system. Gilbert and Sullivan's Fairy Queen was a take-off of another powerful woman in a more serious form of opera, Brunhilde, a shield maiden and a Valkyrie in Norse mythology. Wagner's Ring Cycle was first performed in London in 1882. And of course, there is Pandora. According to the myth, Pandora opened a jar, in modern accounts sometimes mistranslated as Pandora's box, releasing all the evils of mankind, leaving only hope inside once she had closed it again. She opened the jar out of simple curiosity and not as a malicious act. The most famous semi-theriomorphic figure is the Sphinx. British painters do not appear to have painted the Sphinx in any symbolic paintings. There are, however, two French paintings which deserve mention. The first is painted in 1808. You can see here that Oedipus is on the front foot and the Sphinx is in shadow. Contrast this with the later work. In this later painting, the Sphinx is shirt-fronting Oedipus, who is somewhat on the back foot. One cannot draw too much from just two paintings, but nevertheless the second painting shows a much more confronting version of the instinctual feminine. Reactive paintings. Reactive paintings share some of the same archetype as the St. George paintings. But whereas the St. George paintings involved man controlling woman by protecting her, the reactive paintings demonstrate a more direct exercise of power. Whereas the St. George paintings involve a certain degree of contractual agreement between the man and woman, the reactive paintings demonstrate a degree of unilateral force on the part of the man, or at least the use of unconscionable persuasion. One way of controlling women is simply to enslave them. Of course, the slave girl is a way of portraying the beauty of women without shaming the woman. The slave girl is available, and she is in a sense blameless because she is powerless. Women seeking emancipation in the Victorian era may have identified with the slave girls. Many hysterical women, women who were unmarried and without any outlet for their sexual libido, may have been attracted to these paintings of white women under the power of dark men, as they were in a later generation attracted to Rudolph Valentino. Of course, the dark man is symbolic of primitive, unchained libido. Here is one French painting where the customer is examining the girl's teeth. And women can be contained, made safe by marriage. One woman of Greek background laughed when she saw this painting and said it reminded her of what happened when she was young. This artist simply put the woman on ice. I have the feeling that the artists were often experimenting with women, putting them in different situations. Tibet must have held some fascination for the British at the beginning of the 1900s, following the Young Husband expedition into Tibet in 1904. Tibet is also the location of Rider Haggard's sequel to She, titled Aisha, published in 1905. The Victorians were always looking at remote places, places remote in time and places remote in distance. The mermaids came from under the sea, the nymphs from the woods. Rider Haggard's books, She and Aisha, were set in ancient Egypt, darkest Africa, and then in Tibet, always pushing out beyond the known world. But of course the unconscious lies beyond the known world. Here the woman is fascinated by butterflies. Perhaps her mind is chained by frivolous thoughts, or is she using the butterflies to mentally escape from her chains? Zenobia was a 3rd century queen of the Parmerine Empire in Roman Syria. She led a famous revolt against the Roman Empire. In 274 she was defeated and taken as a hostage to Rome by Emperor Aurelian. And women, like the Virgin Mary, can be bound by patriarchal religion. This painting shows the death of Hypatia, a Greek Neoplatonist philosopher in Roman Egypt, murdered in AD 415. This painting shows women bound not only with religion, but also put in chains and fed to wild beasts. This painting shows women bound in 6 ways. They are lying down, they are asleep, they are locked in a cell, they are tied to a wall, they are bound by religion, note the cross, and they are going to be fed to ravenous beasts the next day. There is also the symbolism of the dark, instinctual woman being under the protection of the white, civilized woman. Note the symbolism of level here. This is one of the most significant and fascinating paintings in the National Gallery of Victoria in St Kilda Road, Melbourne. Interestingly, the name of the artist was St George Hare. Acceptance paintings. In my view, these paintings are paintings by artists who are accepting women and not trying to control them or expressing fear. There is Pygmalion, who is perhaps representing the quickening of women from imprisonment in stone. And there are a number of paintings of women sleeping or lying down resting. Maybe the artists feel they are safer when they are asleep. But in any event, these paintings tend to normalise women. And finally, I think these paintings represent an acceptance of women as women, a normalisation of women acting outside the Virgin Mary archetype. Women just hanging out. Women below stairs. On the one hand, these women are presumably slaves, but they could just as well be workers outside a factory. Women engaged in ritual. More ritual. I put this one in because it is in the National Gallery of Victoria. Painted in Victoria and exhibited at the National Gallery of Victoria, Federation Square. Women in a new relationship with their children. And of course, Aphrodite. Beautiful women in their own space. Conclusion. I hope this has given you an insight into the expression, through art and storytelling, of a range of feminine archetypes in the collective unconscious of late Victorian Britain. A number of things, in my view, came together to make this possible. The confidence, wealth, pride, openness and curiosity of the peoples of the British Empire. The pouring into Britain of ancient and modern foreign religions and cultures, symbols and motifs. A community of skilled artists and writers who had the courage to portray materials from the unconscious in painting and literature. These paintings demonstrate the difficulty British men had to adjust to feminine emancipation. In Australia, we also went through the same process. The British men, in conferring equal rights on women, did not see women as equal, but as different and fascinating. Men saw them as deserving equal rights, and they were fascinated by their beauty, but they were also deeply concerned about the perceived dangers they presented. What does this painting, painted in 1909, mean? Perhaps the mermaid represents the past. Women as confined by patriarchy, forced to live in the formless world of water, ruled by instinct and only half human. And perhaps the child represents the future, a golden child, the potential of what women, freed from patriarchal control, would become. Thank you for listening.